So my name is Irene Horais. I am the moderator here, and I am very happy also to welcome our guests, our experts on Venezuela. First of all, Roxana Vigil, who joins us from New York, I guess, Roxana?
From DC.
From Washington, D.C. So I have been asking before, but nobody could tell me. So Roxana is an International Affairs Fellow in National Security at the Council of Foreign Relations in Washington, D.C. Council of Foreign Relations is a non-governmental U.S. think tank, and they have two centers, actually, one in Washington and one in New York. So Roxana has 15 years of experience in the US government, specializing on foreign and national security policy towards Latin America. She served as the director for Andean Affairs at the National Security Council and in several roles at the US Department of Treasury and US Department of State. In the Council of Foreign Relations, her research is focused on Venezuela and on Colombia. So thank you very much for joining us, Roxana, and so we are very happy to have you with you. Then I welcome here Mariano de Alba. Mariano de Alba, you are a Venezuelan, so both of you are Venezuelan here, Venezuelan lawyer specializing in international law and international relations. You are currently Associate Fellow at the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London. And prior to that, you were Special Advisor at the International Crisis Group and for Venezuela, among others, and as Associate Director for the Atlantic Council. And you just told me before that you may join again the International Crisis Group.
Maybe.
Maybe, yeah. Then we have here also Feliciano Reyna-Ganteaume. You are visiting us from Venezuela. Mm-hmm. And Feliciano comes from the NGO context in Venezuela. You are the founder and president of Acción Solidaria, is an NGO working with people affected by AIDS-affected people. And you told me this afternoon that you have moved from support to people to AIDS to human rights, or the human right to health and to life, and then also to general human rights. Mm-hmm. And since the humanitarian crisis, when the humanitarian crisis in Venezuela deepened, that you have founded also a humanitarian program in your NGO. Mm-hmm. So Feliciano is now member of different coordination platforms of human rights and humanitarian NGOs. He is the co-author of several reports on the human rights situation in Venezuela for the UN Human Rights Council, and he's a well-known and highly appreciated Venezuelan voice, both at home and also in international fora. And actually, we know each other from your activity in, as member of the humanitarian platforms in Venezuela. So to come to our topic today, so Venezuela hasn't been very much in the focus here in Austria. Venezuela hasn't been very much in the focus of international attention, actually, until, I would say, last September, October, November, and in particular until January 3rd, when the US launched a military attack against Venezuela's capital, Caracas, and captured President Maduro and his wife, not to forget the wife. A little bit later, President Trump announced the detention of Maduro for alleged involvement in narco-terrorism. Mm-hmm. And underlining the US aspiration for hegemony in the region, he also announced that the US would run Venezuela for a while, so whatever that means. Seize the oil exports and manage oil revenues, saying for the good of the American and the Venezuelan people. This is quotation. So by then, many Venezuelans were rather happy about the capture of Maduro, and they hoped for regime change. They hoped also for the end of political repression and the end of the humanitarian crisis. President Trump then sidelined Nobel Prize winner Maria Corina Machado. He sidelined, who is the leader of the opposition, and instead Delcy Rodriguez, who is the vice president of Maduro, was sworn in as the president of the country, and all the rest of the government remained largely unchanged, if I understand well. So what are the plans for Venezuela? What comes next for Venezuela? Is there a hope for regime change? Is there a hope for political opening? Is there hope for economic recovery? So is there a hope also for the return of the 8 million refugees, Venezuelan refugees in Latin America and the US? And what does it mean also for the region, for Cuba, for Nicaragua in particular? So, Feliciano, I want to start with you. Venezuela is a very rich, resource-rich country. So if we look at present figures of poverty, nobody can believe that Venezuela is that rich. Instead, Venezuela has been, between the 1950s and 1982, Venezuela was among the 20 wealthiest nations worldwide and Latin America's richest country. By then, many Europeans, also Austrians, moved to Venezuela to work in international companies. Venezuela was also a very modern country, so also by European standards, home to a relatively large educated middle class. And between 2008 and 2020, suddenly Venezuela dropped, the Venezuelan GDP per capita dropped by 75% without any war. Mm-hmm. So this is kind of unbelievable. This is figures that we only see in very war-torn countries. So today, Venezuela is one of the poorest countries in the hemisphere, a broken infrastructure, broken health and education system, and extremely high levels of poverty and high levels of insecurity. So, Feliciano, can you explain us shortly how your country came to that? So what happened without any war to come from being the richest to being the poorest?
Thank you very much, Irene. Thank you to the Kreisky Forum and for all of you to be here. I'm glad also to see Roxana from DC and to share this space as well with Mariano. Well, it's very difficult and it's somehow frustrating as well because I was able to live through some very good years as a child, as an adolescent, and then through part of my professional life in Venezuela before founding Acción Solidaria, this HIV and AIDS NGO. So, you know, when we saw these changes coming in 1999 with the election of President Chavez, even opposing what he proposed, we have to remember that he had staged a coup in 1992, and also as a civilian and one who wants to see civilians in power. He came from the military, but there was a huge hope in his administration. We had reached levels of over 50% of poverty, which was something hard to believe and to accept, you know, in a country of wealth, as you're saying, Irene. And but as time went by, we went through different moments of political crisis, basically political crisis. A coup against him, then an oil strike, and so on. This started happening through the years. An attempt by him and his side to change the constitution There was a failed attempt. And then, all of these different sort of political, electoral moments in which, people were called to express themselves also brought with them different types of political conflict. We had, again, attempts of strike, and then, people manifesting, protesting in 2013. He had just passed away, and Maduro had been elected president. And then 2014, 17, 18, and so on. So we have been going through, for many years now, through political, economic, and social crisis that came afterwards. Regarding the political, unfortunately, what we saw for a while was that, this sort of attempt to change some of the institutions, so somehow co-opt these institutions, particularly those that are involved in justice processes. For example, the change in the Supreme Tribunal, extending it to 20 judges from 12, and then sort of, again, co-opting that space. So we saw these sort of, in a way, abuses of power, breaking that possibility of equilibrium between the different powers, executive, legislative, the administration of justice, and so on. And then at some point also starting to use resources, oil resources that were very high. Venezuela was producing from 2.8 to 3 million barrels per day all through the 2000s until about 2014, from 2.8 to 3 million barrels of oil, with very high oil prices, even up to $100 per barrel. So when Chavez passed away, he had been creating funds that were getting some of these resources and putting them aside, not part of the regular state budget, right? And those funds were being used for different purposes, but without transparency. So when he passed away, this is 2013, and we had Maduro elected as president, this coincided with the moment in which the oil prices dropped very steeply, and then slowly that use of funds that were undermining the capacity of the oil sector, of the oil business, started showing, of course, that all that undermining when these prices dropped. So at some point, if one looks at the production in Venezuela, it started dropping from 2.8 million barrels to 2.5 to 1.9 to 500,000 barrels. So it was really steep drop with these oil prices as well going down. So of course, this was accompanied by a social crisis, a major social crisis. I couldn't go into much more because there's so much to say. But to us, when we as human rights organizations, this is an important moment, and it's when we met you, Irene, and the EU's humanitarian sector, ECHO, when we presented for the Human Rights Council a series of reports on the human rights, human rights situation in Venezuela, economic, social, and cultural rights, political and civil rights, as well as the institutionality in Venezuela, and then some vulnerable people. What we saw were the effects, again, the social effects as well as the institutional effects of a crisis that had been building through the years. And what we saw then was that we were sort of moving away from, say, some problems in regards to human rights, again, in the administration of justice and so on, but much more deeply into one structural destruction of the guarantees of protection for people, unfortunately. So this manifested, for example, in those protests for when the social situation became so serious, then harsh repression, people being detained sometimes on bogus charges, and at times enforced disappearances, situations of torture, and so on. And in regards to the social rights, again, because of the economic crisis, then we also saw, for example, how people started feeling forced to leave Venezuela because there was no way to be able to cope within the country. Nowadays, just to make it, one step now forward all the way to today, we have been implementing this study on the ground. 70 organizations were doing home service. And what we're seeing now is about 18 million people, which is 64% of our population, living in very poor conditions, direly. Of them, some 5.5 million, it's 20% of our population as well, completely deprived of any possibilities of living, say, in a dignified manner. We're seeing as well, for example, in our public health system, 70% physicians and nurses have left, not left Venezuela, but the health system, the public health system. We've seen also that same situation in schools. So we have lack of teachers, but also 1.5 million children and adolescents leaving school. We're seeing also the lack, for example, of electricity, water, transportation. So it's a whole sort of systemic situation that is affecting the majority of the Venezuelan people. And finally, one effect that we saw, and it was what made clear that the situation was becoming so dire for the population, was the forced migration, which started it started in 2015, but by 2017, it increased. Nowadays, we have about 30% of our population abroad. Most of that part of those who migrated had to do it because they could just not cope inside Venezuela. So if we see changes nowadays, in spite of, say, of course, there was a breach of international law in this intervention and so on. I will come to that later. But what I want to say is that despite that, those who have migrated, we'll see if they come to Venezuela or not.
So we will touch upon that later. You mentioned a lot now on, you mentioned things on human rights, on how to say, corrupting the institutions, etc. But it does not explain 3/4 of reduction of GDP per capita. So this is not a war. We have a lot of countries in the world where you have grave infractions of human rights, but a 75% of drop in GDP per capita, this is kind of something outstanding. I don't know, maybe you want to add something?
I mean, I think
Venezuela, because I think it's very important also what is the dependency, what is the play on the dependency on oil, on the petrostate, which is Venezuela, what was the role also of US sanctions in this decline, because there was a huge effect of US sanctions, so maybe you can add something on that.
No, I mean, very shortly to answer, I think that the short answer to the question of what happened, why 70 to 75% of the economy crashed in a very short period of time, is that there was an untractable and unsolvable political conflict. When Chavez arose to power in the year 1999, he arose to power in confrontation with what had been the political and economic elite of Venezuela for the last at least 40 years. So very, very shortly, as Feliciano mentioned, very shortly after he came to power, his government not only started a process of co-opting institutions, but also really debilitating all the institutions. And by debilitating institutions, I basically refer to starting a process of eliminating the independence of the courts, eliminating the independence of the other authorities, like for example, the National Electoral Council, eliminating the independence of the Attorney General and so forth, and also, very importantly, eliminating the independence and politicizing the armed forces. At the same time, his government, because as Feliciano mentioned, it managed unbelievable amount of resources, increased to the maximum the amount of corruption that was already present in Venezuela before he came to power. So this new elite that surrounded Chavez and even normal people that saw an economic opportunity to make a lot of money very fast simply by having a connection to a public official and sharing the money of a business or of a budget, they arose as a very strong political and economic elite, because we also have to be very clear that when Chavez came to power, even until his death, he had the support of a majority of the Venezuelan population, many of them people that in the 40 years previous to Chavez felt excluded of the system, people that were very poor, and that by seeing Chavez in power felt vindicated that their voice, their concerns, their interests were being heard and taken into account. The other side of the coin is basically the strategy of those who opposed Chavez for many years, or Chavismo until today, which was, as Feliciano mentioned, 4 years or three to 4 years after he came to power, he suffered also a coup d'etat, because the strategy of those who have opposed Chavez or Chavismo historically has been a strategy of basically there's no other way out of this political conflict than basically wiping out of the map Chavismo. So what we really need to do is find a way for Chavez to go and we recover our country. So that basically turned into a very untractable political conflict that had, as Feliciano mentioned, its expression when the prices of oil crashed in the year 2014, and then you found that the so-called economic stability of Venezuela was a fantasy, because you had a lot of corruption, so people had already grown accustomed of stealing money from the state. And also, because of that corruption, many of the qualified technical people that had been in charge of the oil industry had left, because they didn't want to have so much political oversight and so much political direction from the people in the Chavez government. So you found a country that, highly dependent on oil, with corrupt institutions, and that corruption was essential to keep Chavez and Chavismo in power. And then you had an opposition that didn't see any sort of solution or possibility of compromise, and obviously the government has a lot of fault in this also, than to try to seek a change in government. So that basically was what caused the crash of the economy, in my view.
Yeah, plus the sanctions.
Of course, and then very importantly, the sanctions, the financial sanctions established by the U.S. government, because by this time it's the year 2017.
Trump won.
Trump's first administration. So the economic situation in Venezuela is already terrible. And you have the opposition that has tried for many years to get Chavismo out of power without success. So the government the opposition has decided on a strategy that the only way to bring about change is through international pressure. So the opposition starts moving its efforts abroad, and obviously also Chavismo has part of the fault here, because Chavez and his movement basically grew politically, also challenging the US government, and also to a certain extent getting involved in illegal activities, like for example narco-trafficking and other activities against the interest of the United States. So in the year 2017, when the economic situation was already bad, Trump decided to impose first financial sanctions, and then in the year 2019, when the Trump administration recognized the opposition as government, but the opposition didn't really have the control of the institutions, Trump decided also to impose oil sanctions. And that's where basically Venezuela's economy really found itself in a very dire situation, because Venezuela had been historically a partner, let's say in another way, Venezuelan oil, its natural market had been historically the US. And then when the US imposed its sanctions, Venezuela had to find other destinations for that oil, basically in Asia, which is farther away from Venezuela. And also because of the sanctions, nobody from the US, but also no other serious company from Europe really wanted to get involved in doing business in Venezuela. So you have also an issue of reputation. Doing business in Venezuela, dealing with Venezuelan officials, etc., became something very frowned upon, at least in the West. So the economic alternative for the country at this time, a country that, as I said before, highly corrupt, with very weak institutions, produce a situation where basically the amount of money coming into the country, although it's still relatively substantial, it was not being directed to the benefit of the people, to keep public services, to pay good salaries for the public officials, but basically everything, all the money, all the less money that was coming into the country was being directed to help Chavismo stay in power.
Thank you. So coming there now, we are coming now to the Trump first, who tried to get Maduro, to bring Maduro to fall, and didn't succeed. Yeah? In the first time. Now we are coming to the Trump administration number 2, and Trump administration number 2 and the opposition is of Venezuela lobbying also for foreign intervention and asking for foreign intervention. So this is kind of the how to say by the end of last year, so we have seen a huge gathering of US military in the Caribbean. So the US Navy has shot boats of alleged drug traffickers, and there has been something like a kind of blockade, also seizing some oil tankers leaving Venezuela. So the pressure amounting to Venezuela, and they culminating in the attack of January 3rd, where the US Army flew in and in a night attack. So they captured President Maduro and his wife, and with this photo of having Maduro so as a prisoner, brought him to the United States and accused him for drug trafficking. So, but then happened something that when certainly, I know that the first titles in Western newspapers were, so this will bring the democracy to Venezuela, because Maria Corina Machado had won the Nobel Prize just before, so everybody expected her then to be made the legitimate president, and Trump didn't do that. So he maintained Chavismo in power, sidelined Maria Corina Machado, saying that she hasn't really the support in the country, and announcing that the US would run the government. So Roxana, so you are talking to us from the United States, so you are the expert on that. What does this mean? So the US running Venezuela. So we know that the US, they have seized the oil production and oil exports and oil revenues coming out from Venezuela, or the Venezuelan production and exports and revenues. So what happened then in practice? So, and what are the goals? What are the real interesting goals then behind this, the US strategy for Venezuela?
Yes, thank you. Good evening, and a special hello to Feliciano. Lovely to see you, and to Mariano as well. So, you raised the question of what is the goal here? Oh, yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay.
I just asked, is the tone okay for you? Yes. Yeah. Okay. Good.
Okay.
Okay. Go ahead.
And I think one of the challenges that we're seeing now, we're over 2 months out since the January 3rd intervention, is that there is still very little clarity as to what the ultimate US government objective is here in Venezuela. We know President Trump's very focused on the oil sector rebuilding. And there are, of course, lots of concerns with that, and we can get into that. We've seen now 2 cabinet level secretaries go down to Caracas and meet with Delcy Rodriguez as if she were a legitimate democratically elected president, which she is not. And you have all the different justifications from that period that you mentioned last year, when you started to see the buildup of the naval deployment. There were justifications related to migration given for the buildup, related to drug trafficking, related to different activities happening in Venezuela, and a real effort from the US government to malign Maduro and his regime. And so now you have the Trump administration without a real explanation or a real coherent strategy working with Delcy Rodriguez's regime. So it does raise a lot of questions. We do have President Trump focus on oil, and Secretary Rubio trying to bring some more clarity. But from my view, it's not enough. It's not clear. How is this going to play out in the next 12 months, the next 18 months, the next 24 months? And so what's happened in the last 2 months is a big focus on the oil sector. You've had the reestablishment of diplomatic relations between the United States and Venezuela that took place just a few days ago, on the heels of the visit from Secretary of Interior Burgum. You have a small mission, that's my understanding, it's a small mission that is going to be largely focused on this oil sector and mineral mining sector objective. But what we've heard, some of the questions related to, is that going to be a meaningful rebuilding, and who will benefit? Because so far it's President Trump, his senior leaders working directly with Delcy and her representative. To my knowledge, and would welcome, if there's any information contrary to this, there's no seat at the table for anyone representing Venezuelan civil society. There's no seat at the table for anyone representing the Venezuelan opposition, which we know won a presidential election in 2024, wasn't allowed to take power. And the big rebuilding that would need to happen to meaningfully rebuild Venezuela, we've heard President Trump say it would take $100 billion over 10 years, which is correct in terms of some of the other experts that have looked at this issue from 2019, when Juan Guaido came on the scene. And he, there was a big focus for regime change then by the first Trump administration, and a lot of thinking that took place in what would it take to rebuild if there is an opposition government, a democratically elected government, a US-friendly government in power. So that big rebuilding doesn't seem very likely under the current political crisis, because as Mariano said, the crisis is still ongoing. It has not been resolved. And it won't be resolved until you have a transition process. Now, I do want to acknowledge that the military operation itself was a tactical success. But and it seems that President Trump prioritized stability. Yeah, I think in a very narrow sense, the short-term stability to achieve these sort of very narrow resource extraction objectives. But there's no clear plan on what a long-term stability approach looks like for Venezuela based on what's been laid out by the US government. In terms of your specific question related to oil flows, there's very little transparency from the Trump administration on what these oil flows will look like, who will benefit, how they will be controlled. What we do have is an executive order that President Trump issued that protects the oil flows that the U.S. is going to manage, the oil proceeds from the sale of Venezuelan oil that the U.S. is going to manage, protects those proceeds from Venezuela's creditors trying to attach their claims to those proceeds. This is a really big problem for any Venezuelan indebted.
We don't hear you.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Venezuela is highly indebted. There is about $150 billion of debt that the Venezuelan government owes. So whenever you have assets around the world that could that a creditor could attach to its claims, that those assets are at risk. So that was one of the first official steps that you saw the U.S. government take, which was to protect the Venezuelan oil proceeds. The other step that you saw the U.S. government take is announce the establishment of treasury-controlled accounts where this money would flow into. But there's no information on who is going to control the flow of the money. How is that going to be decided? What kind of agreements does the Venezuelan government need to make to ensure that the money won't go to the same criminal structures, corrupt structures that have essentially caused the crisis in the first place? And then there's the question of the Qatar accounts. So we know that at the very beginning, the US government was sending the oil proceeds of the Venezuelan oil sales to Qatar. Of course, in the United States, there were a lot of questions and concerns about this because it seems very unusual and it was different than what had been announced initially. My understanding, based on the very little information that the Trump administration has shared, is that there were $500 million that went to Qatar. Eventually, they went to Delcy Rodriguez's interim government, and that those accounts are no longer being used, and that the oil proceeds that the United States is managing they're now going into treasury controlled accounts. It's not clear where those accounts are. There's a lot of questions. And the very last thing I'll mention is the oil sector sanctions that has been raised here. And I think we need to remember John Bolton, the National Security Advisor in the first Trump administration, made very clear it was a regime change policy, and the oil sector sanctions were designed to deprive Venezuela of oil revenue. And they did that. They also, I think, caused a lot of negative consequences for U.S. interests, including pushing oil that was coming to the United States, pushing it to China, and forcing Venezuela to look to other markets to supply diluent, which is the lighter crude that an oil input that's required to mix with the heavy and sour Venezuelan crude. And it's interesting seeing the Secretary Rubio now say that one of the benefits of the intervention is that U.S. can flow, Venezuelan oil can flow to the United States, and United States diluent can flow to back to Venezuela, which is essentially the pre-sanctions commercial dynamics. So it's almost like you have 6 years of a failed sanctions regime and all of this, military action, military intervention to restore back to the pre-sanctions commercial dynamics. And it's really important, even though there are these sanctions carve-outs, these exemptions that are being issued right now, they are temporary in the sense that at any point the Trump administration can revoke them, and that the sanctions architecture has not changed. It remains in place.
Okay, Thank you very much, Roxana. I will interrupt you here because I think matters are very complicated, and I just will try to summarize a little bit. You can correct me. So what happens actually is, okay, so Trump left the Chavista government in place because in the search of stability, even if they have no legitimacy by elections. But Chavismo controls the army, or has the army, Chavismo controls the police. So basically the forces, the armed forces in the government, security forces are in place as they have been before. So, and then going to the oil sector, which is the primary interest probably of President Trump. So I understand that they started by seizing, I understand you that the US started by seizing or by forcing all oil export being sold to US firms, but the revenue going first to a Qatar account in Qatar. Yeah? And I think this has been interim, and now they are going, these exports, the revenues are going to an account controlled by the Treasury, by the US Treasury. And then somehow and sometimes being reversed to the account to the Venezuelan government in order to be able to function, let's say. Is this more or less right? Yeah. Did I get you rightly? Yeah. Okay, so they have been gone to Qatar, then going back now to the US Treasury, and the interim government in Venezuela is also obliged to present monthly its budget, for Treasury control. So how they are budgeting their money. So they are basically put under kind of US tutel. Mm-hmm. Did I get this right? Yeah? Yes.
Oversight, US oversight.
Yeah. This was a kind of language problem of mine. So it's the US oversight. So US has monthly oversight of the budget. So they are looking of what happens, how much they get into their treasury, into their accounts, etc. Mm-hmm. So they are basically quite bound also now to the US.
Yes, I mean, I think that the main, let's say, specification of this is that, the Venezuelan government has other sources of funds. So this is not the only fund of money that the Venezuelan government has. It is the main one, because now Venezuela is selling oil basically to Western actors, to Western traders, at the regular oil price of the market, which is substantially higher than the one that Venezuela was selling to Malaysia or to China under sanctions, because that oil was being sold at a discount. What we know so far, and Roxana is right on this, there is very little clarity, is that apparently all those oil sales have generated at least $1 billion already, at least. They also really recently signed a contract to send Venezuelan gold to the US for at least $100 million. What we know so far is that money is, the traders are paying to a US Treasury account, but from what we know so far, it seems that all that money is being fairly quickly redirected to the Venezuelan government controlled by President Delcy Rodriguez without any specific public conditionality of how to spend that money. And yes, maybe formally Delcy Rodriguez has to present a budget like this month, I need $300 million to pay public employees, the police, and so forth. But there's no really control. And from up to my knowledge, the U.S. has not said, "Oh yeah, of this $1 billion that I have received, I'm only going to give you 300 million if you do this." No, there's no. From what we know, there's no conditionality in that regard. So in a sense, when President Trump, going back to what you mentioned, when President Trump said that the U.S. is now running Venezuela, that is...
Not I said, he said
He said it, yeah, exactly. He said it. I think it's mostly a metaphor. I think that, President Trump tried to get rid of Maduro in his first term. He did not succeed. Even in his first term, he was already proposing publicly that he wanted a military intervention in Venezuela. Come to his second term, I think that the situation in the world is one where first the US wants to enter more forcefully into a geopolitical competition, especially against China and also against other actors like, for example, Iran, which the Chavista government, the Maduro government, had developed very close relations. So, and also there is this rumor or theory that President Trump sees the world under a spheres of influence mindset, which means that the US, as had been historically, they are the US government is the sheriff, the policeman of the Western Hemisphere. And third, and a very important geopolitical development that I think that President Trump, and let's also remember one fact, the Trump administration is made of different factions, and each faction has its own interest. If you go to Secretary of State Marco Rubio, you get certain policies. If you go to other people that are more interested in doing business, you get other set of recommendations for President Trump. But what was really clear is that I think, and we are seeing it right now, it's not only with Venezuela, that the Trump administration arrived to power for a second time with this view that the US had to start using more regularly and more forcefully its military capabilities to show strength in this geopolitical competition. So it is true that the Western Hemisphere, Latin America, has had for many years a problem of narco-trafficking. But that problem of narco-trafficking, the main sources of the problem have been Mexico, obviously with its cartels, and also Colombia with its cocaine production. What happened? That it is also true that since many years, even before Chavez arrived to power in Venezuela, so in the 90s, it is true that part of the drugs coming out of Colombia with the ultimate destination of mainly Europe would transit through Venezuela and then would start making the journey towards Europe. That's true. And it is also true that even from before Chavez became to power, but obviously this phenomenon grew with Chavez and Maduro in power, it is also true that this drug transit gave rise to a corruption scheme where especially military people from Venezuela would allow the drug to transit Venezuela and leave Venezuela without any problems in exchange of receiving some monetary payment that would go to the pockets of the military. So the Trump administration saw this problem and said, we're going to deal with this in a military manner, so we're going to start striking those boats. And it's also true that even before Trump returned to power, there has been many years of allegations that this drug scheme in which the Venezuelan government has taken advantage of the drug transit to get money, it was a scheme that was allowed and was enticed and was promoted even by very top Venezuelan officials like President Maduro. So in the year 2020, in March 2020, when Trump was still in power during his first term, the US Justice Department issued an indictment, an accusation against Maduro and against other people in power under its strategy, as Roxana said, of regime change, saying that Maduro was the head of this criminal organization allowing the drug transit. And then in execution of that indictment, of that accusation, it was that the US argued that when we went to Venezuela on January 3rd, this was not really, they said, obviously it's not true, they said this is not a military operation, this is a
judicial.
Yeah, an enforcement of the indictment. What is two things? So one thing that the Trump administration said last year was that Maduro was the head of a cartel. Surprisingly, when Maduro was presented before New York courts, that very direct accusation was toned down by the Justice Department. And two, Maduro, we don't know why or how, he was allowed to be, I suppose that he was allowed to be captured by the US government with his wife. His wife, Celia Flores, who was a very important political figure in Venezuela. She was sort of like the lady behind the power. She controlled very closely, especially the judicial authorities. A very clever woman who was a lawyer for Chavez many years ago. Maduro's wife had not been accused by the US system. Surprisingly, when they arrived to the US issues this new indictment, this new accusation, including her wife as a basis to having her imprisoned in the US. So that's basically the situation.
Yeah. So that's the situation of Maduro there. That's the situation of Venezuela with an interim government and with and with Venezuelan oil revenues basically controlled by the US Treasury. In the meanwhile, so this is 7 weeks ago, Feliciano, I want to come back to the political and human rights situation. Also, in the meanwhile, what happened in Venezuela? So when I called you in January, so you said, yeah, that's true, it is a US invasion, but maybe there is some opportunities in it, and maybe there is some hope for, even if the Chavista government is still in place, there may be some hope for political prisoners to be freed and for the human rights situation to be improved. So what happened since then? Has that been the case?
It's still a short time after January 3rd. It's about 9 weeks now. And from the very beginning, there was hope that things would change in the country. What was unexpected was that the same group that had been in power would be represented now again as the Venezuelan government. But many, and I think including those from the side of Chavismo, are seeing this as an opportunity for change, probably hoping some to stay in power, and others of us just saying we have to, again, seize this opportunity to effect change. One of the things that we were going to push for, and it has happened, was the excarceration of not only political prisoners, but others who have been in prison for different reasons, who have not had any guarantees of due process, who have had all sorts of irregularities in their processes. And as well, we have to think that besides the 1,000 that were there in January, and now we understand that some 600 people have been released, there were about 11,000 people with charges pending. Mm-hmm. So they were sort of released on conditionalities. But now this is also being part of this process that comes out of a new amnesty law that has some flaws, it's true, and those have been shown by organizations who presented their questions, to the National Assembly, but also parts of that legislation have been used as well to get, people released.
So you say, so Delcy Rodriguez and the National Assembly, now in this period, they have issued a law of amnesty, which allowed also to free political prisoners and others which are in the way of managing if they can get rid of their charges.
That has happened. Yeah. I have to say that since 2024, there was a a debated presidential election, but about 2,000 people had been imprisoned, most released, but again, with charges pending, including a nephew who'd spent 6 months and just by being close to where there was a protest. But anyway, so this is one thing that we're seeing as a good sign. The other one, and I think that Roxana mentioned, hearing the voice of people in Venezuela, we had a closure of the civic space, humanitarian space, the space for public debate for a while. And in fact, again, in 24, 25, we were seeing nurses, physicians, teachers, even community leaders protesting for lack of education or for the state of disrepair of the health, hospitals and so on, being imprisoned just for that and with very serious charges on them. So again, those were released, and now what we're seeing is more of an opening of public debate. In fact, for the amnesty law, for the first time in years, we saw human rights organizations going to a National Assembly and expressing their concerns. And the third thing that we want to see, and this goes to this idea of speaking us in Venezuela about our interests as Venezuelans, and hopefully accompanied by the international community, not just with one actor, which is the US, with its very specific interest. We really want to bring, also to put on the table what we're seeing on the ground, which is, again, the dire conditions of many people, very dire, the situation, again, in the public school system and health system and so on. So that if we are able to, again, as Venezuelans, civil society, union leaders and so on, to put those issues on the public agenda and own the process, I think that at least, we'll be able to, out of this, we'll be able to get hopefully some good results for the Venezuelan people. It's going to take a while. It's a slow process, but yeah.
So since we have to come a little bit to an end here, so to open also the questions to the floor, just perhaps a last question to Roxana, and I ask you for perhaps a short answer. Venezuela is also rich in gold and in minerals. So it's not only oil. So Venezuela is also is also rich in rare earth, in lithium, tantalum, in all these minerals which are so important for technological progress today. And we understand that it is part of the US security strategy or policy now to control these kind of resources in the hemisphere. And currently you have there Chinese exploitation and a lot of exploitations and informal exploitations which are going, and the minerals are going kind of anywhere. Could you just say a word on or elaborate a bit on that, on the interest, on the on the potential of the mineral resource in Venezuela for the US government? Are they reachable? Is this exploitable? Is this really an asset?
Yeah, happy to comment on that. So we saw just last week the Secretary of the Interior take a big delegation, including with 24 US private sector representatives, to focus on this very issue. And I think coming out of that, it is very clear there is potential, there is opportunity. Venezuela has reserves in a lot of the critical minerals that the US government is interested in, but you're going to face the same challenges as and the same concerns that we're seeing in the oil sector, plus a really important security component. So with regard to the sort of concerns with investing in Venezuela, the political stability is going to be the number one concern. And I think you're not going to be able to address that with the interim government that you have now. So investors feeling confident that they're able to have a safe investment, that they're able to, rely on the institutions in Venezuela, the rule of law, all those concerns that you have with oil sector, and the reasons you have major international oil companies saying they are not going to throw new money into Venezuela's oil sector. The players that are already there have said they want to invest. Chevron, Italian company Eni, Spanish company Repsol, right? They're already there. And the oil sector providers are a bit different. They have a different perspective. But new investment in the oil sector is going to be hard. And I think you're going to see the same concerns in the mining sector with this additional layer of the security situation. So a lot of the places, and I think Mariano and Feliciano have touched on this a bit, which is of the places that are rich in some of these different minerals, and gold is a big one. And gold is part of the deal that was cut between the Trump administration and Delcy Rodriguez interim government just last week, this gold deal. You have different armed groups, including Colombia's armed group, the ELN, active in a lot of these areas. They control some of the different mining activities, which are usually small-scale artisanal mining activity that's going on for some of these minerals, particularly gold. And it's a very high-risk environment with the Venezuelan armed forces often in collusion with the armed groups and benefiting from the activity. Changing that incentive structure, I think, is going to be really challenging. And the security guarantees that the Venezuelan interim government has made to the United States are almost, it's very hard to imagine them being able to actually commit and carry through on the security guarantees, because their own security forces are sort of in cahoots with the different armed groups that are active. And then just the last point, when it comes to large scale mining, you're going to need infrastructure. You're going to need electricity. These are electricity heavy industries, and you would need to build that infrastructure in Venezuela, which will take big investments and a lot of time.
So this does not look very promising, but you told me this afternoon, you Venezuelan both told me this afternoon that you believe that economic progress will be possible in the near future. So there might be opportunities. And in terms of, Roxana says that she doesn't believe that the present government can deliver stability, sufficient stability for investments and for kind of this economic progress to happen. So just the last word, and then we turn to the floor. So
I think that, first let's go back to what we discussed. This is an economy that crashed almost 75%. So there is ample room for economic recovery. That doesn't mean that the economy in 1 year, in 2 years, in 5 years, it's going to be the same, the size of the economy is not going to be the same that it was in 2012, right? Mm-hmm. First, another problem that the US has that is very relevant in my view, and Roxana touched upon it, is that the US doesn't have the same, let's say, political system than China, which is state capitalism. China can meet with the board of directors of many companies and say, well, now you go to this country and invest. It doesn't work that way with Western companies. They have their own reporting obligations. They basically, the masters of Western companies are its shareholders, right? So I do believe that, with the companies that are already in Venezuela, there's room for some partial economic recovery. The issue of political risk and political stability, it's obviously very, very much present, and that is what is going to hinder new investments. Why? Because you have, this very fragile setup. From a political standpoint, you even have people from the Venezuelan opposition saying internationally, wait a second, this is not a legitimate government. any contract that they signed is void from the start. So how do you invest, I don't know, 100, 300, $1 billion when you have this threat that if the opposition comes to power, there is the theoretical possibility, I don't think that it is practical possibility, but the theoretical possibility that they will disavow all those agreements. However, the US has also taken some measures to lower that political risk. For example, in the licenses that the US Treasury has issued, all the contracts that are signed between oil companies and Venezuela, the applicable law to those contracts and the forum to resolve any dispute is not Venezuelan law, it's not Venezuelan courts, it's US law, US courts. And finally, I would also mention that obviously this is not what is at hand is not the possibility of an economic boom, but an economic improvement that if those resources are well managed, there's great possibility, because we are an oil economy, that it could have an impact on public services and eventually on the well-being of the people. The problem in the longer term is that, you know, as I mentioned before, you have two elites that are very opposed to the idea of sharing power and sharing and working together in institutions.
Two elites, you say, the opposition?
Yeah, the opposition, let's say broadly speaking, the opposition and Chavismo. I think that the correct US policy in this moment would be to push those two elites, for which they have a lot of leverage in relation to those two, to actually start a process of negotiation and trying to define how they are going to reframe, how they are going to rebuild the Venezuelan institutions. And I think in that regard, there's also an opportunity, because Chavismo, if one thing defines Chavismo as a whole, is that they don't foresee the possibility of leaving power, right? Mm-hmm. But right now, after the military invasion, given that, you know, the possibility of defense of Venezuela was non-existent, that the armed forces of Venezuela couldn't do anything, there are strong considerations and strong forces for Chavismo as a movement to do two things. One is do whatever the Trump administration asks, especially in the economic domain, so they can, you know, have more income. Money, yeah. And two, they also think that, you know, the situation that was in the country before January 3rd, which was, as Feliciano mentioned, you know, very little civic space, total control by the institutions, so basically an untractable political conflict, that situation no longer favors the interest of Chavismo. I'm not saying that Chavismo from tomorrow is going to turn into a wholly democratic government, but I do think that they are willing to take some steps to lower the political confrontation in the country, and that is an opportunity that also has to be seized by the opposition.
So, Feliciano, please, I don't give you the floor now because I want to give the floor to the public.